week. And there is a lot to talk about. So we still have plenty more to explore and discover tonight. We began with a concept which I'd like to speak a bit more about, which was the concept of oneg, which is having pleasure, deriving pleasure from our Shabbat experience. We're specifically commanded and encouraged to enjoy Shabbat on many different levels. And we described how in Hebrew the word oneg means that not only one element of us is taking pleasure and enjoying, but it's all encompassing and it happens on a number of layers and levels. Just to go a little bit deeper, on Shabbat we actually gain an additional soul. It's called the neshama yetera, an additional soul, which we don't have during the week. And this soul is, souls in general, we can divide them, they can be divided into 5 categories, but we're going to focus on the first 3 categories of the soul, which are nefesh, ruach, and neshama. So you have nefesh, which is the lowest level, shall we say, of the soul. The nefesh is related to and connected to our blood, our digestive system, our liver, our physical processes. Our nefesh is what keeps our body surviving, growing, flourishing. It's very connected to our most physical, basic functioning. Then we move up a level to the level of ruach. Ruach relates to the midot, to the emotions. So obviously that's a level more, which is slightly more spiritual than the basic physical processes of the body. It relates to ways that we try to find expression in creatively, the way we feel, and all the different emotions that we go through. The level above that is called neshama. Neshama is connected to what we have as uniquely as humans in comparison to the rest of the creations in the world, which is free choice, bechira chofshit. We have a mind that we're able to use to think rationally, to go beyond physical instincts, and we can delve very deeply into ourselves, and we can choose to override the way we feel, override our first reaction to something, and decide we're going to act like this or like that in a specific given situation. So why is this important, and how are we going to connect this to Shabbat specifically? So when God created the world, everything that is created with God's energy, with God's divine light. Obviously, when we look around the world, we don't actually perceive and recognize in an instinctive way the energy of God that exists in everything. When we see another person, when we see a specific object, we see that for what it is or what they are on a physical level, right? We see a man, we see a child, we see a table or a chair. We're not looking at the object and saying, oh, I see the spark of God inside of it. Now, ultimately, God would like us to reveal and peel away the layers that cover over that divine godly energy within everything. And we do that by utilizing, if it's an object, then utilizing the object, or if it's an individual we're interacting with, then the nature of the interaction should be meaningful, should be purposeful, should be something that uplifts, that elevates, that's positive. In our regular weekday mode of functioning, in the way that we relate to the world in the Yemei Chol, in the weekdays. So we are on a plane where we are more focused on the physical and mundane side of things. And while we are supposed to do what we can to still uplift and elevate, it is much easier to forget or to have a harder time noticing or pulling out the divine energy that might exist in a given situation. On Shabbat, the second level of the soul, which is called Ruach, usually it's more attached, during the week it's more attached to the lower level of the soul, which is Nefesh. But on Shabbat, it attaches itself to the higher level, which is Neshama, because Shabbat is all about uplifting and transcending. The entire world gets lifted up. So that means that we actually have an easier time to access the godly energy, the divine, meaningful potential in a particular thing and in a particular situation. So therefore, when we go about preparing for Shabbat, when we set up a beautiful table, when we sit together and eat delicious foods, when we are enjoying a very wonderful Shabbat experience, which it's not purely spiritual and separated from worldly enjoyment. It's not that at all, and it's not supposed to be that. We're very much in the world. Part of the way we celebrate Shabbat is eating and drinking and sharing time with the family. However, because we are in a state where our soul is more connected to a higher level of spiritual consciousness, it's easier for us to elevate those physical experiences and make them into something more spiritual and more uplifting. So I'm going to share a video which is going to tell us a story that's going to bring out this idea.
The Baal Shem Tov was luminescent one Friday night, and his students sought the reason for his unusual joy. He answered with a journey. After Shabbat ended, he and his entourage piled into a wagon and headed for the village of Abt. "I am looking for Shopsy the bookbinder," said the Baal Shem Tov. When the humble man arrived, the Baal Shem Tov greeted him warmly. "Tell us about your Shabbat, Shopsy." "Rabbi," the trembling bookbinder began, "there was not a penny in the house. The home was barren of food, of wine, of candles. Rabbi, I despise gifts. I don't like being a burden. I told my beloved not to ask anyone for anything and retired to the synagogue to study and pray. When I returned home that night, the house shone with candlelight, and the table groaned under the weight of meat and fish. My wife rushed to me and said, 'Do not be angry. I did not speak to a soul. Listen to my story. When you left, I figured if we cannot cook for Shabbat, at least we can clean. I scrubbed every crevice furiously, and in a small crack in the floor in the corner of our house, I found 2 pearls from my bridal diadem. I ran to the market to sell them and bought the Shabbat feast.'" "Rabbi," Shopsy continued, "I was confounded with joy. Instinctively, I grabbed hold of my wife's hands and we danced around that table. We danced until we lost track of time, until our legs gave out. Then we celebrated Shabbat." Shopsy fell quiet. The Baal Shem Tov said, "Shopsy, when you danced with your wife, the angels danced with you, and heaven reverberated with joy that spilled down onto earth. heaven does not need to see another spiritual epiphany. Heaven delights in the body's discovery of the joy of Shabbat.
So that's a very, very nice story that happened a long time ago, but brings out the message of the importance and the beauty of the body, the family, in a very literal way, enjoying and celebrating the Shabbat. So having said that, we are going to look in detail at some of the things that some of the delicacies that are traditional, that grace many Jewish Shabbat dinner tables across the world, and look at them in a deeper way, give some of the history so we can get a better understanding of why and how these traditions came to be. So I'm going to share with you a slide over here. Okay, so we have the foods of Shabbat. Now, last week we spoke about the fact that we use wine to begin the 2 meals of Shabbat, one Friday night, one Shabbat day. And we also spoke about the meaning of having 2 loaves of bread at the table, which we start the meal with. So tonight we're going to move on to the next course. So over here, what I have is a quote from the Talmud, which quotes the verse, "V'karata la Shabbat oneg." Okay, you should call Shabbat oneg, which means you should make sure that you have pleasure on Shabbat, which I mentioned back at the beginning of the class. So, of course, this is the Talmud. It's going to be a discussion and a question. What exactly does oneg mean? So, oneg heve omer, this means ze oneg Shabbat. It should be the pleasure of Shabbat. All right, so we have a statement, we have an injunction. You need to have pleasure on Shabbat. Now, what would be the next question? What form should that pleasure take? In what way do I make sure that I have pleasure on Shabbat? Should I go to the beach? Should I sit down and play a game with my family? What is the pleasure of Shabbat? So this is a discussion in the Talmud. But Ango, how do we take pleasure in Shabbat? So one opinion over here brought by one of the sages is to eat, number 1, beets, number 2, a big fish, and number 3, heads of garlic. Now, why these 3 specific foods? So the commentary, Rashi says, he says about number 1 and number 3, that the reason why the Talmud speaks of these 2 is because in those times, those specific dishes were considered very important foods. So on a day that's holy and special and you're trying to have extra pleasure, you're going to prepare foods that you consider to be more of a delicacy. And in those times, this is what they were. And fish is another one. Now, the Talmud continues. We're going to move on to the 3rd box over here to describe how some of the sages used to prepare for Shabbat. So we have over here 2 particular sages, one who is Rav Safra, one who is Rava. Rav Safra used to prepare for Shabbat by barbecuing the head of an ox, and Rava used to salt a big shibuta. Okay, shibuta is the Aramaic word that's used in the Talmud and is explained by Rashi to mean a fish. Okay. Now, first of all, before we speak about the actual foods, just to point out, you have these great sages great Torah scholars, teachers of many students, heads of academies, and they themselves used to, on Friday afternoon, make sure to take the time to prepare some delicacy for the Shabbat meal. And the reason for this is as you see at the bottom, a quote that I bring: "It is preferable to do a mitzvah on your own than through a messenger." So I'll just give you an example, which perhaps you may or may not be aware of. In marriage, so the way that we do this, the ceremony is the groom gives an item of value to the bride to create that marriage, that official marriage bond. So today, and for many years, for numerous years already, the custom is to do it with a ring. Now, really, the groom and the bride don't have to be both in the same place in order for this to happen. It's also okay, perfectly acceptable and binding for marriage if the groom would appoint a messenger, hand the ring to the messenger, and have the messenger bring the ring to wherever the bride is located. Obviously, we're talking in a very technical sense over here. But however, we don't behave like that, not only for this reason, also for other reasons, because it is preferable to do a mitzvah on your own than through a messenger. The groom himself should hand the ring, put the ring directly on the bride, on her finger. And the same is true with other mitzvot. If we ourselves are able to be involved in preparing for them and in making sure that we are ready to fulfill them, it's extra merit for us, and it's a much greater way of fulfilling the mitzvah. So we're going to look at fish because we know that fish is found on Shabbat, on the Shabbat menu the world over, whether you're Ashkenazi and you are familiar with gefilte fish, or you're not Ashkenazi, there's still a strong tradition of fish. We have the Moroccan fish that's very well known, and it's something that's part of our associations with Shabbat. So why specifically fish? What meaning, what message does it bring with it? So if we look back through the Talmud and we look back in history, way back, we see that Jews tried very hard to have fish on their Shabbat table. And just to give you an idea of the lengths that they would go to, there's a story also in the Talmud of a Jew by the name of Yosef Mokir Shabbat. Joseph, the one who held Shabbat dear. Mokir Shabbat means holding the Shabbat dear. That was his name. He was known by that name. He was so famous for how much care he would take to prepare for the Shabbat, to have delicacies for the Shabbat. He was also known for sharing those delicacies and those and the feasting with poor people in the town who were not as fortunate. And he used to take great care to make sure that he had fish for Shabbat. Now one week, it came Friday afternoon, and the local fisherman, he was at the river, at the sea, and he was casting out his net, and to his surprise, he came out with an unusually large fish. So he comes to the shore, and it's very close to Shabbat already, and everybody is basically ready and prepared for the Shabbat, and the fisherman doesn't know who to sell it to. So he asks around, and people see the people see the fisherman with this big fish, and they say, you know what? You know who's going to be the one to buy this fish from you, who won't hesitate? Yosef Makir Shabbat. He loves the Shabbat. He honors the Shabbat in the best way that he can, and he will be more than happy to buy this fish for you. Now, before I tell you what happened with Yosef Makir Shabbat and with the fish, I want to move to a different character who lived in the same town. And he was known as Yivan. He was a wealthy man, and he was very stingy. He wanted to hold on to all of his money, and he wanted to make sure that nobody would get any part of it. He had worked hard for it. It was going to remain his. Now, one day he had a stargazer. This was something that was more prevalent in those times. They would look at the stars and do astrology and see the future. And the stargazer came along to this individual, hi Judy, and he said, you know, I have something very, very important to tell you. You are going to lose your entire fortune. And this rich man was shaken and shocked and thought to himself, oh no, this can't happen. And the stargazer said, yes, and it's going to go to this man, to Yosef Makir Shabbat. So upon hearing this, of course, Ivan was very anxious to make sure that he does what he can to keep hold of his wealth. So he sold everything that he had. He sold everything, and he converted his all the money that he gathered together. He bought a massive diamond, an absolutely huge diamond. And he thought to himself, I'm going to take this diamond, I'm going to sew it into my hat, I'm going to wear this hat all the time, it's going to go with me wherever I go, and that way it's going to be safe and nobody is going to be able to get it from me. So he, feeling relieved and feeling like he had a good plan, he did what he said, and he went on with his life. And one particular day, he was walking across the bridge, and a gust of wind came along and blew his hat off his head. And of course, he was devastated because he knew what was inside that hat. And he started, my hat, my hat, my hat. And the passers-by, they did what they could. They tried to help him. And they found the hat. But the diamond had slipped out. It was nowhere to be found. It had been washed away in the river, and he was absolutely devastated. He'd lost everything. Going back to our friend Yosef, who we spoke about at the beginning of the story, the fisherman arrives at Yosef's house, very close to Shabbat. He says, I have this big, beautiful fish. Will you buy it from me? And Yosef looks at the fish. He says, wow, what a tremendous way to honor the Shabbat. Of course I'm going to buy it from you. And the fisherman charged him a pretty penny for that fish because it was very large. But Yosef, he wasn't a wealthy man, but he didn't hesitate because he knew that it was in the honor of Shabbat. He bought the fish. He hurries inside with the fish, gives it to his wife, and they slit open the fish. And lo and behold, inside the fish, they discover this gigantic diamond. And when he sold that diamond, it says that it was worth 13 stories of gold. Now, what exactly that means is subject to debate. You know, if it was 13 stories of gold of a building or another opinion, but obviously this expression is to explain to us that it was really a fortune of wealth, and Yosef was able to honor the Shabbat in a very special way for the rest of his life. And it says about this story that he who honors the Shabbat, or he who takes care of the Shabbat, Shabbat will take care of him. So because he extended himself to always honor the Shabbat and prepare the best food that he could, God rewarded him. And through his preparations for Shabbat, he received a great fortune in return. So that's just one rather famous story, which shows us the lengths to which how important they felt fish was in honoring the Shabbat. Another story brought in the Talmud of the great, well-known leader by the name of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, Rabbi Judah, the Prince, as he was known. He was the one who compiled the Mishnah. So on the day that he passed away, you can imagine there was national mourning everywhere. Jews all over lost a leader of such great stature. He passed away on a Friday, and he was buried the same day. So obviously it was quite a lengthy ceremony. He was actually taken to 18 different places along the way of his funeral. And Shabbat was coming. And there was a miracle took place on that day in his honor, and the day was suspended. Instead of Shabbat coming in at the time that it was supposed to come in, daylight lasted longer, and it says that the reason why it lasted longer was so that the Jewish people would have enough time to get home and light the Shabbat candles and roast a fish for Shabbat. So again, we have this idea of preparing fish in honor of Shabbat. So this is more in the historical context, right? We don't yet really know why, but we do see, and I'm just bringing you two specific stories, but there are more stories and other instances where the importance of preparing and buying and preparing a beautiful fish for Shabbat in its honor is seen as something very wonderful and very great. Now, on Shabbat, we actually, I did mention that there are two meals, but in fact, as some of you probably know, there's also a third meal on Shabbat. So the third meal takes place in the afternoon, and it's not like the other two. There's no kiddush. It's not the same formal kind of meal, and different communities have different customs as to how far they take that, preparing and eating this meal. Some will sit down for a full meal with bread. Some will just have a snack or a drink. But there is a concept of this third meal of Shabbat. And the rabbis talk about eating fish on Shabbat. You should specifically make sure to eat fish during that third meal. Why specifically during the third meal of Shabbat? Also in the other two, but why specifically the third? Because Moses, he passed away at the end of Shabbat. That was the time that he passed away. And therefore, it's a time of God watching over us, because Moses was the prophet and the leader who he was. It's a very auspicious time. It's a time that God watches over us in a very special way, which is compared to fish, because fish, they never close their eyes. Fish, their eyes are always open, and that symbolizes the way that God is always watching over us, because God never slumbers nor sleeps. He's always awake, and he's always able to watch over us and take care of us. If we would follow the chain down through all of history, we would see that fish doesn't feature so strongly all the way through. We have these many strong examples in the Talmudic era, but later on, not as much. And we see in more recent teachings of the Shulchan Aruch from a few hundred years ago, where it speaks about the importance of eating fish on Shabbat. But what we're able to see is that it's not a halachic requirement in the sense that, you know, we have a law, we're supposed to light the candles. We're supposed to sanctify the Shabbat by declaring that Shabbat has come in verbally, and we do that on a cup of wine. Fish does not fall into the same category as that. And the actual fact is that really it comes from a more Kabbalistic root. It's more of a Kabbalistic custom, which is very interesting. And one of the explanations we are told about this is that sometimes, or many times, the soul comes down into the body of an individual, and the soul has a mission that it's supposed to fulfill. Now, over the course of a person's lifetime, of course, we do what we can to the best of our knowledge and in the best way we know how, depending on the circumstances that we come across and that we find ourselves in, to behave and to choose in the correct way. But we are human, and we do make mistakes, and we do miss opportunities, and sometimes the soul will go through its lifetime having done many, many myriads of wonderful things. But it could be that there are a few things left that the soul did not accomplish that still need to be done. And in that case, there will be reincarnation. The soul will come back into the body of another individual in order to have an additional opportunity to rectify or to have those opportunities again that they missed in the previous life. Now, not always does the soul need to come back into another human being. It depends how much that soul needs to fix, or how much that soul needs to do still. And when we talk about the souls of the righteous, mostly they have everything, you know, they're righteous, and they're very much in touch with the spiritual side of themselves, and they know what they have to do. So really for them, very little, if anything remains to be done, it's very little. So the soul of a righteous individual, of a tzaddik, could come down into a fish. And as we spoke at the beginning of the class, we described how everything in this world has godly energy, has a divine spark, which we are tasked, we are supposed to uplift and elevate by using it for a good purpose, for a meaningful purpose, for a holy purpose. When we eat fish on Shabbat, we are taking a fish, we are utilizing it for something very holy and very meaningful. And in that way, we are elevating the divine spark in that fish. And in the case where there may be a soul inside that fish, we are having a part in elevating that soul by using the fish and eating it in honor of Shabbat. I actually remember, this reminds me when I was studying after high school in Israel. So we were in a class one day, and a fly showed up in the classroom. Now usually flies buzz around, they, you know, if there's movement, they move away from people. But this particular fly, it was quite large, and it landed right on the desk of the rabbi who was teaching us. And even though he was very animated and he was gesturing, the fly just sat there and wasn't going anywhere. So to kind of, I don't know if he was trying to amuse us, or if he was a bit disconcerted himself, because it was quite an unusual looking creature. He said, you know, I think there's got to be a soul in here, a reincarnation of somebody who's come back and needs to sit here and hear these words of Torah, and that's why it's not budging and it's just staying right over here. And he, you know, he sort of extended the entertainment by speaking to the fly and continuing to teach whatever he was teaching to the fly. So, but anyway, that concept definitely exists in different forms, and it was just an entertaining way that it was brought to life. So there we have it about fish for Shabbat. And it's interesting, actually, just one more thing I want to add. The Alter Rebbe, who was the first one of the Chabad leaders, he lived at the turn of the 18th century. So he actually authored a Shulchan Aruch. He authored a code of Jewish law. And when it came to this particular custom of eating fish, so he did, even though he very much encouraged that fish is very important and there's Kabbalistic meaning to it, and if we can, we should try and buy fish for Shabbat and enjoy it. He did say that if there is price gouging, because in those times you had the non-Jews who, if they would learn that it's important for the Jewish people to eat fish every week, they would hike up the prices so they could earn more money. And knowing that the Jews would do whatever they needed to do to keep the Shabbat, so they'll spend the money. So the Alter Rebbe made sure to tell everybody it's better that we shouldn't buy fish for a number of months, so that the fishmongers shouldn't try these tricks, rather than only the wealthy being able to buy the fish. So I just thought that was an interesting piece of history to share. Moving on to the next item that we were going to discuss, we have the cholent, or the meat stew. Okay. This takes different forms in different communities, but definitely whether you're Ashkenazi or Sephardi, whether you have potatoes or rice or chickpeas inside your cholent, the concept of having a hot stew on Shabbat day is something quite well known, and also a bit curious, right? Where did it come from? How is it so widespread geographically all over the world, in different Jewish traditions? Where does it come from, and what is its meaning? So interestingly, it comes from way back, a long time ago. A debate between two streams of Judaism. I think I may have mentioned it in passing last week, but we definitely didn't speak about it at all in detail. The Torah says that you shouldn't have a fire burning in your house on Shabbat. Now, there's the written Torah and there is the oral Torah. Okay, the written Torah, if you take a Torah scroll and you open it up, you know what it looks like inside. You just see the letters of the Torah. There are no vowels. There is no punctuation. That is the written Torah. The vowels, even the vowels and the punctuation, are part of an oral tradition. How do we know where one verse starts and ends? How do we know if a word is to be read as chalav, which means milk, or chelev, which means fat? It's got the same letters. That's part of the oral tradition. So while God dictated the written tradition, the oral tradition was taught in its entirety to Moses and passed on. And there are things that the rabbis themselves had to come to understand and explain according to certain rules. This is obviously an entire topic in its own right, which is beyond what we can discuss in this class. If any of you have taken some of my husband's classes, you may know that he has a series on this, which really goes into detail. So, but we're going to do it. We're going to do it in a short summary. So, in the literal sense of the meaning, without the oral tradition, it sounds like we're not allowed to have any fire burning in our homes once Shabbat has come in. So if I light a candle before Shabbat, I cannot light it to leave it burning after Shabbat comes in. Now that, of course, is incorrect, because the oral law explains that you are allowed to prepare fire before Shabbat to burn on the Shabbat. You just can't light or stoke a fire on Shabbat itself, because that would be forbidden. There was a stream of Jews that did not believe in the oral Torah and the oral tradition. And they followed the Torah according to the very literal meaning of what it said in the verses, which is considered to be denying an entire portion which comes directly from God himself. Just to give you an example, another example, the Torah it gives men the commandment to lay tefillin. Okay, the tefillin are the black boxes with the straps. How do we know that tefillin are black boxes with straps? The Torah doesn't say that. The Torah doesn't even say what tefillin are. It just says put tefillin on your head and on your arm. The reason why we know is because of the oral tradition, where it defines it needs to be made out of leather, and it needs to be made in this, this shape, and this with these verses inside, with parchment, whatever, all the details. So in order to show our faith and belief in the oral Torah, it became a very strong custom, as a demonstration of belief, to prepare a dish before Shabbat that would be placed in the oven or on a fire or whatever overnight and enjoyed piping hot on Shabbat day, to demonstrate and to show belief in the oral tradition. This is allowed. Not only is it allowed, it's a wonderful way to take pleasure and enjoy Shabbat, because obviously you can't compare a cold meal to a hot meal, especially on a winter Shabbat afternoon in Illinois. So it really became something quite quite a strong custom and tradition. Now, obviously, we'd like to make it as enjoyable, and we want to use, foods that we consider to be important, to be a delicacy. So we put meat in there, because meats, it is written also that we should eat meat on Shabbat as well. So while the ingredients don't have to be so specifically specific, the main point about the cholent, the stew, the dafina, whatever you call it, depending on your tradition, is this idea of showing faith in the oral Torah. And we actually see described in the Talmud how the showbread in the temple, the temple had the shulchan, it was known as, it was called, which is the table. It wasn't exactly, it had 4 legs, but it also had shelves above it, with compartments for 12 different loaves of the showbread. And this bread used to be baked every week, Erev Shabbat, and it used to be placed on the shulchan, on the table on Shabbat. The ones from the previous week would be taken out and the new ones would be put in. And it describes how when the new ones would be put in, they would be hot. How could they be hot? They weren't made on Shabbat. They were made before Shabbat and left in an oven. Obviously, there was some miracle going on here, because I'm not sure if you would leave bread in an oven for an entire night for about 18 hours or however many hours. How fresh and delicious it would be, but in the temple it was, and like that it came out onto the table. So we see even from then that that they had this concept of keeping food hot into Shabbat. In fact, in a miraculous way, the bread would actually stay hot and fresh the entire week. And the reason why I specifically want to mention this tonight is because the portion of the week, this week, the Torah portion, speaks about the three miracles that took place in in Sarah's tent, our matriarch Sarah. She had 3 miracles that took place. Her Shabbat candle stayed lit from one week to the next. The dough, the bread that she prepared, there was a blessing in it for an entire week as well. And she also had a cloud of glory, a cloud of holiness surrounding her tent. All 3 things which showed what a righteous woman she was. And in this week's portion, when Abraham sent his servant to find a wife for his son Isaac, how did Isaac know that Rebecca was a good wife for him? Because when she came into Sarah's tent, all these miracles that had disappeared after Sarah's passing, they suddenly returned. So we see a very direct similarity between the abode of our holy, righteous mothers and the temple. And in fact, the tent of our mothers came before the temple. So that's just something to to take note of and to think about. Just to relate a story which underlines how important the rabbis felt it to be to eat this cholent or dafina on Shabbat. The previous Lubavitcher Rebbe, so the Rebbe, he was the 6th Rebbe, the one before the last Rebbe. One Shabbat they were celebrating in a particular location, and there was a chassid, an individual who was responsible for taking care of all the food, where it would be, making sure that everything was ready for the Rebbe, for the chassidim, for the students, for everybody who came to celebrate together. But this particular chassid was also known for being very devotional, and he used to spend many hours in prayer. He was well known for really spending time contemplating, meditating, and it would take him many long hours to pray. And that particular Shabbat, he went to pray, and he got lost in his meditations and in in contemplating and connecting with God. And it came time for the meal, and the time for the meal passed, and he was nowhere to be found. So of course the meal started, they made kiddush, they had the challah, and so on, but it came to the time for eating the cholent, and nobody knew where it was. And this particular chassid, he was so involved in his prayers, he didn't notice the time, he didn't notice anything that was going on, and nobody could find the cholent. So having no choice, they finished the meal, they did the grace after meals, and then finally, as the day was drawing to a close, all of a sudden the chassid comes running. He's like, oh no, I forgot the cholent, I didn't tell anybody where it was, and he brings it out. And the Rebbe did it. What did the Rebbe do? He didn't say, oh, we finished the meal. He actually said, you know what, we actually have to wash again and restart, because the cholent is so important. It's such an important demonstration of faith that we need to make sure to partake of it and enjoy it. Now, obviously, if for some reason, if you're not able to eat the cholent, or it's too heavy for you, or it doesn't bring you pleasure or enjoyment, you could fulfill this also by just having any warm food that or even a hot tea that comes from an urn that was prepared before Shabbat is the same idea. Just having something hot that is being prepared from something that was ready before Shabbat fulfills this in exactly the same way. So obviously, for those who want to be sticking strictly to the traditional, it would be the cholent. But if it's too much, or if it's too heavy, or any other allergy or intolerance or anything, the main point of Shabbat is the pleasure of it, right? So that's another thing to bear in mind. This idea of hiding away the cholent, right, like this particular chassid did. When we look at the words in the law and in halakha, which describe how we put the cholent away, the word used is called hatmana, which literally means to hide away. there's different methods. I mean, you can you have a crock pot, you can leave it in the crock pot overnight, or you can leave it on a hot plate, or if you have a low setting on your oven. I mean, for things sometimes by me on Friday night, this wouldn't work overnight, but for Friday night, if I have like one pot that I want to keep hot for a few hours and I don't want to use an appliance, I'll wrap it in 2 blankets or 2 towels to keep, because if it's like a big pot of soup, that keeps the heat for a few hours. So there's different ways to do it, but the expression used is lahatmin, which means to hide away. And one of the ways we can understand this on a deeper level is that Shabbat, we've spoken about a few reasons why we keep the Shabbat. So one of them was because we are commemorating, just as God rested on the 7th day after 6 days of work, we are also resting on the 7th day. So it's a reminder of creation and that God is the one who runs the world. We also spoke about how it's a reminder of the fact that God let us out of Egypt and freed us from being slaves, because just like we can choose to work, we can also choose to stop. We're not enslaved to our commitments and to our obligations. So that's another reason. And a third explanation of the celebration of Shabbat is that it's like a taste of the world to come. Me'en olam haba, a taste of the world to come. Which has to do with the idea that we spoke about, which is that when Shabbat comes in, it's like all our work is already done. We've reached perfection and completion. Now, the world to come is described as a world that ayin lo ra'ata. Nobody has ever seen this world. Nobody has ever experienced this world. We don't know what it looks like. So the idea of the cholent being hidden away, it's something that no one has seen, is sort of reminiscent and associated with that idea of this me'en olam haba, this world to come that we are anticipating and waiting for, that is so lofty and so transcendent that nobody has yet seen or experienced it. Now, if you like some mathematics, I did say before that it's written that on Shabbat we should have basar, dag, and yayin, which is meat, fish, and wine. So I don't have this in a slide, I'm sorry. So I hope you can follow, but there is, as I mentioned, there is a concept that Hebrew letters of the alphabet are equivalent to a numeric value. So Aleph is 1, Bet is 2, and so on and so forth. Now, there's a concept known as gematria, which using the numeric value of a Hebrew word teaches us something. But there's different ways to do it. You can use the actual numeric equivalent, or you can use it in slightly different ways. So for example, Bet is 2, okay? Reish is 200. So there's gematria in mispar katan, which means numeric value in small numbers. You only take the first unit. So if you have a Bet, you'll obviously use the number 2. If you have a Reish, you'll also only use the number 2, even though it equals 200, because we only work with the first unit. So if you take the word basar, which means meat, dag, which means fish, and yain, which means wine. So you have the first letter of basar, which is Bet. That's a 2. You have the first letter of the word dag, fish. That's a daled, that's 4. So 2 and 4 is 6. And then you have the first letter of the word yayin, wine, which is a yud. Yud is 10. But we're working in small numbers. So we're not doing the whole 10, we're just using 1. So you have 2, 4, and 1, that equals 7. Okay, which is obviously Shabbat is the number 7, 7 days of the week, the 7th day of the week. So we're using these foods to celebrate the Shabbat. It doesn't end there though. If you move to the second letter, so basara, the second letter is Sin, which is 300. So we're working only with the first unit. So that's 3. Dag, the second letter, is Gimel, which is also 3. And Yayin, the second letter, is 10 again, which is 1. So 3 and 3 and 1 is again 7. Now for the last letter, we're actually only left with 2 because the word fish, the word dag, only has 2 letters. So we're going to just use the last letter of basar, which is reish, 200. So that's 2. Hang on. Yeah, sorry. Basar 2. Reish is 200, so that's 2. And then you have the nun at the end of yayin, which is 50. So again, we're only using the first unit, which is 5. So 2 and 5 is again 7. So that's just another way to see how eating the foods of having wine, fish, and meat are specifically connected with ways that we can physically enjoy and celebrate the Shabbat. And I know it might sound cute, which in a way it is cute, but really I think this teaches us and shows us how in Torah, every detail is carefully thought out and calculated. It doesn't just happen to be, even if it's just on the level of numbers. There's deep meaning in there, and that those numbers are going to be connected to the custom, and the custom is going to be connected to a deeper meaning. And it's really the way Shabbat is supposed to be, because Shabbat is supposed to infuse all the layers of ourselves. I mentioned in the beginning of the class the extra soul that we have and the different levels of the soul, which are nefesh, ruach, and neshama. Nefesh being related to the physical processes of our body, ruach being related to our emotions and our creative self-expression, and neshama connected more to our intellect and the way that we can make free choice. Because on Shabbat, we're supposed to infuse each of these elements and uplift each of these elements of ourselves. And I believe over the course of these classes, we've discussed this in different ways. So today we focused more on the very physical, practical eating of food and taking pleasure in physical enjoyment. But emotionally as well, I mean, if I would ask you to think of a favorite childhood dish, whether it's connected to Shabbat or not, it could just be something that you really liked when your mom made that. So while of course I'm sure it was delicious and tasty, the reason why you have such wonderful associations with it is not only because you liked the way it tasted on your tongue, but also because of the way you felt when your mother served it to you, or the way that you would all sit around the table and enjoy it together as a family, for example. So the atmosphere of enjoyment also comes along with a physical experience. And there are different dimensions in pleasure. So if we move up from the physical dimension to the more emotional dimension, let's think of something like music. Listening to some beautiful music, whether it's a beautiful voice or an orchestra, that brings great pleasure on a different type of level. Learning, studying, thinking about an idea and analyzing it and working through a concept and coming to understand it, that gives tremendous pleasure as well. And it's on a completely different level. And on Shabbat, we can do all of these things throughout the course of the day, and sometimes even at the same time when we sit around the table and we're eating a delicious meal. And we are also singing Shabbat songs or other Jewish songs. And we are discussing the portion of the Torah, or we're discussing family values or how to make the world a better place. We're bringing all these elements all at the same time together, and we're really infusing and uplifting all the different layers of ourselves. And this is something that doesn't just start on Shabbat. We actually work towards it during the week. When we buy the food that we're going to use for Shabbat, when we think about what we'd like to talk about at the table, we're already bringing Shabbat into the rest of the week. And obviously it comes to its culmination when we actually have that celebration, all of us together. So we're really talking about a multifaceted experience which penetrates all the different layers and needs to be brought into all parts of our lives. And as we said, that's really what oneg is. Oneg, pleasure, means that all parts of us, all layers, all dimensions equally are deriving pleasure and involved and invested in the experience together all at the same time. So who knew that gefilte fish and cholent would give us this kind of perspective on the Shabbat? But I hope it's given you something to think about. And I'm sure the next time you see some gefilte fish in the supermarket or you enjoy a Shabbat dinner, you'll think about these things, and hopefully that will uplift the experience for you even more than it already is. So thank you for joining me this week. I will